Okay, so today is December 11th, 2019, and this is the SIG Auth meeting. So this meeting is now recorded. We have a very full agenda today, and we probably will not get through all these items, but we'll see how far we go and try not to rush ourselves, and maybe we'll make it to the end. So the first item is David Eads has a cap out about CSR signing fields. Do you want to kick it off?
Sure. So we've been talking about various pieces of functionality required to move the CSR API to your screen is going absolutely nuts. To GA. On that list, there are multiple items, but one of them was being able to support multiple different signers. I went through and described a cap for how we could do this using our existing API in a backward compatible way, and identified the different logical signers that we already have today. So logically, there is a signer needed to sign kubelet serving certificates so that the Kube API server can trust the kubelet at the other end of certain kinds of connections like logs. There's a need to be able to sign client certificates that are good against the Kube API server. There's a subcategory of that which can be automatically approved by the Kube controller manager for kubelet client certificates. So I've enumerated the different cases here. And then there's a category of we don't really know what it is. Anything today that someone marked approved was signed by the Kube controller manager signer. So that's an unknown category. So I describe in the update to the CAP how we can transition to this, changes to defaults that I think we should have when going between beta and GA, and then describe in some detail, and there's a few comments outstanding on, I think, fairly minor tweaks to what our signers will sign today.
Cool. I think the one thing that I wanted to think about a little bit more was authorization for approvers to approve certificates for specific signers. Did you respond to that comment? I have not checked back.
I hadn't. I guess I might have passed over that in the noise. You were thinking that you would have a special permission to allow someone to sign for, say, a JetStack signer.
Yeah.
Based on name?
Yeah.
I'm fine with that. That would be something fairly easy to do. I would probably want to do it as an admission plugin, so it could be turned on or turned off. Mm-hmm. Is that something you'd want to see instead in the strategy for the resource so that it can never be turned off?
I think it would have to be somewhere in admission enforced. I don't feel strongly about whether it should be turned on or off, but default on would be pretty satisfying for me. If I think that capability is desirable. We didn't have a field to like segregate signers really before this. Because there was no multi-signer, obviously. And I think there's some value in that being able to deploy kind of multi-tenant signers.
So would you prefer to do something like that, or would you prefer to allow a status field for approval that would allow some sort of sign to certain approver saying, yep, really me? I don't mind doing it either way.
Yeah, that's a good point. Do approvers have names, though? I guess they have an identity.
Approver pair could. Right?
Yeah.
I can accept that it would be easier to have an RBAC permission, and maybe that would be good enough for some people. I don't know for sure what your use case is.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think the JetStack example versus the kubelet CA example is a good one. I want to have deploy the JetStack CSR stack into my cluster, but I don't want the JetStack CSR stack to be able to approve kubelet credentials or node credentials. I could go either way, whether that's a field in the approval condition that says it was approved by this identity, or whether that's RBAC. I think, or something using authorization. I think probably I'm leaning towards the first one because it's kind of what we do with CSR, the creator. Yeah, but I think that this would be a good time to tackle that if that sounds like a desirable feature.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable to me. I can think about it and sketch out that change. I don't think it has an impact on the majority of the flow, just on who is actually allowed to click approve, as it were.
Yeah. Other than that, I don't think there's really anything particularly controversial. You have thought a bit about migrating from V1 Beta 1 to V1, but I haven't, so I'm going to think about it a little bit more. This is something that we've talked about a bunch before, so.
Yeah, finally getting around to it. Feels good.
Yeah. And you're probably targeting V118?
Yeah, beta and 118.
Did anybody have any questions or comments on this?
I'm glad to see it. The devil's in the details for all these little specs about the various signers, but I like the overall approach.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's mentioned in the KEP for like what we plan on doing for V1, but we're not introducing the V1 of the API yet, right? We're just doing the beta changes, and then eventually.
That's right. I'm only planning the beta changes. We're only planning to. There is no V1 yet. It's just that I know as we move forward, I'm going to want to have fields that used to be optional become required, and remove any defaulting. And we have experience doing this with CRDs, and I think the transition there and with admission webhooks was valuable.
Yeah, so the plan would be to get the beta API shaped the way we want, so that the promotion to V1 is basically just changing defaults and making some previously optional things required. So all the fields are represented in a beta release.
Namely, this is required, but only defaulted in the V1 Beta 1 API.
Correct. And then Jordan and I were having a discussion about Legacyunknown, whether we would continue that or not. I think that decision can be closer to GA.
We can GA and then deprecate it. I don't think that its removal is needs to be tied to the GA of the certificates API. It's probably desirable to have it not tied.
I guess the question is whether or not we want such an undefined signer available by default.
Yeah.
Long term.
I think that choice can be made separately from the rest of this KEP, though. Because we have to have it moving.
We have to have it for V1 Beta 1. Yeah. We can decide what to do with it as part of the V1 promotion.
I guess my question would be on, even when you go to V1, the V1 Beta APIs are still there, right? So like you can still try to make.
That's true. So what you end up with is things like we still allow you to create V1 Beta 1 CSRs against the Legacyunknown signer,
Yeah,
But if we
only
announce
for
that it's
9 months.
deprecated, then you could not create a V1 CSR. And so then you have the deprecation period of the V1 Beta 1 API to wean yourself off of using this. That's similar to what you could do with we were really loose and unstructured with CRD schemas in V1 Beta 1. And when you create a V1 CRD, you have to give a well-structured schema.
So are you saying, Jordan, that come V1, it would be illegal to use legacy unknown as the value of signer name?
Potentially. That's what we would need to decide and discuss before getting to V1. Whether legacy unknown was a thing that should be supported long term. So if we decided it should not, then we would disallow creating V1 CSRs requesting that signer. You would have to request a specific signer.
It's probably not something that we need to figure out for this KEP, but I would start at graduation requirements and add the first bullet, which is figure out what to do with legacy unknown.
That's a good point. Like there are things we know we want to change, things we want to make required, things we want to stop defaulting, and then open questions for V1. Yep.
Cool.
Yeah, I didn't have any other things to discuss here about it. Just keep chewing through the open questions.
Awesome. Any other comments on this? Cool. Thanks, David. Check out the KEP if you haven't looked at it already. The link is in the agenda. All right. Polls of note. Client certificate rotation. I think I know which one this is. Oh, Jack, are you here?
Yep. Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, Jack.
Cool. So yeah, Mike, you've reviewed this a little bit, but I just thought it was worthwhile because this has been kicking around for so long.
Yeah.
Back up with the community and having to think about like how do we want this to work? It now looks pretty similar to how the API server does things. So there's kind of a controller and things are resynced every 5 minutes. And that's basically how the cert is rotated off of disk. But also on any new connection, you'll also get a new cert. The reason you can't rely on that alone is because connections can be very long-lived. And if something expires while the connection's open, that's a problem. So I guess, yeah, like I wanted to hear if there are any other opinions about how this would work. And yeah, talk about how it fits in maybe with the kubelet stuff. I don't know. Does anyone have any thoughts?
I remember this PR was posted in the Slack channel like a day before feature freeze for the most recent feature freeze. So sorry, I didn't see it before. I think David has been working on rotation for most of the serving certs. I believe they were also.
Yeah, I was working on that as well on the API server side. So this looks very similar to that. Yeah.
You said it on new connection. Does that mean every time there's a new connection, we ping disk, or am I misunderstanding?
Currently, yes, and that's up for debate as well. I don't know whether in other people's setups connections are not long-lived, but they just are. They seem to be in mine. So that's something that we could evaluate, is whether we need to cache that.
Yeah, I'll say that I'm generally in favor of this, and the approach I've become more comfortable with it, having gone through and done something similar on the server side. I haven't looked through this PR specifically, but it has worked fairly well.
What is the reload signal for those changes, David?
The simplest thing that we do today is we just do every few minutes, we look at the disk. There's only, on serving certs, there's only, order of 10 that you're looking at. And here it would be order of 3. So just looking them up on disk every 5 minutes, works for the vast majority of the time, and it's really simple to do. It doesn't preclude wiring up something like an FS Notify, but has mixed results from FS Notify.
We did not do that for rotated tokens either.
Okay.
Yeah, I think picking a reasonable lifetime, saying like if you're issuing certs and expecting them to get rotated on sub-minute boundaries, like you're probably not going to be happy with this, but realistically, that's not most production cases. That's more like test cases.
Yep.
Although, doesn't some of the spiffy integrations suggest really, really low TTLs on these?
I hadn't seen that on certificates, but I
yes.
could have missed that.
Is it sub hour? Is it sub 4 hours, sub day?
I mean, so I haven't integrated it yet, something we're looking into, but I had heard at KubeCon on the order of maybe 15 minutes by default.
That's not going to be a problem, I don't think, in this case. If you because this would allow you to rotate every 5 minutes. So if you're expiring every 15, that should be okay. I mean, you're cutting it fine.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'd be happy to defer to people reviewing it. I would maybe want to put sanity checks in place, especially if it's connection based, just so that there's a minimum. So if you do rapidly make 100 connections, this doesn't gate on disk. So maybe like.
Well, we could just completely remove the the connection stuff. What's completely like the only advantage of that is it. I mean, there's not much advantage of it, to be honest with you. We could just remove that, but I don't know. Are we aware of any cases where 100 connections could be come up with? It seems to me like there's a connection pool in the client for like API server connections, and it tends to just keep them open. But maybe in like a failure state, it's possible. I'm not 100% sure.
I think that there are situations where you would see rapid connection creation, such as like Heapster crawling through the node proxy would do that.
Okay.
Yeah, if you're using a single client to talk to multiple hosts, that's one possibility. Or if you're making requests and intentionally not using Keep Alive, that's another possibility.
Okay, that makes sense. In that case, I can probably remove that logic completely because I wonder if the 5-minute rotation is sufficient. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I would recommend keeping it as simple as possible. I think this is basically blocked on getting reviews right now.
Yeah, that's fine.
But it's
I just wanted to make sure.
nothing controversial.
Cool. Great, that's all I have to say then. Oh, the only other thing is we can probably refactor the kubelet stuff to just work based off of this. So kubelet handles its own connection rotations right now. We could just instead tell the kubelet rotation stuff, just write to disk and let this do the rest.
Yeah, that sounds like desirable.
Great.
Especially if we got rotation without needing to run the certificate manager. You could rotate outside of the kubelet process.
Yeah, that might be possible. Cool. Thanks.
Awesome, thank you. Next on the agenda is Greg and Chris. Are you here? Christoph?
So I'm here. I don't know if Greg is here. Greg, are you here?
I don't see him sitting at his desk.
Okay. All right. Well, then maybe I'll just start talking. So I guess I'm thanks for having me. I'm one of the leads in the team in Google that worries about application security, and in particular, the area I've been working on is trying to design application stacks and frameworks so that ideally developers aren't able to make impactful mistakes that cause security bugs. And so we recently had some discussions around this pattern of having secrets exposed in the file system. And the concern there is obviously that when that's the case, then it basically elevates the impact of like a directory traversal file inclusion type vulnerability to one that exposes those secrets to an attacker, right? And so it kind of feels somewhat parallel to this brouhaha that we've seen about the metadata server APIs, where a server can basically be tricked into fetching a secret from the metadata server and then exposing it to an attacker. And like a sort of directory traversal bug is kind of very similar in nature, right? It's a somewhat easy to make application level mistake that then, based on the design of what's behind that, exposes valuable secrets. And so, yeah, so I was kind of wondering if there's any way we can maybe steer developers to not rely on this pattern and use different APIs for getting their secrets. And it's kind of difficult, right? Because this is kind of a nice general way of exposing secrets without application code having to call into a specific API. But on the other hand, that's basically exactly the problem, that they're not doing that.
Yeah, this came up in the security audit as well. I think what I would like to do is to have an option for secrets that where Kubelet encrypts the secret and then stores the encryption key in an XADDR, extended attribute for the file. And that way, the consumer of the secret would have to read the extended attribute, which are not usually available from directory traversals, and unencrypt the file. It's a little bit more work, but it's not like writing a different RPC call in your application. I think other options were potentially exposing the TPMs to containers. I know Linux has like some capabilities exposing a portion of the TPM to specific containers, and putting encryption keys there. Do you have any recommendations?
I think either one of these would address this problem, because it would basically require that an application that wants to access this secret has to use some kind of special piece of code that typically wouldn't be in the code path of something that is usually vulnerable to directory traversal. I mean, it's possible that somebody will basically write a library wrapper and then expose that to untrusted input, but it seems like these are things that an application will typically read at startup, and that's tends to be a different code path from code paths that are then accessing files later on based on external input, right? So for instance, you might have an application that reads like a language-specific a resource file, like a CSS or a piece of HTML or something, and it looks that up based on from a local file based on a parameter that indicates a code for the language. And then if they make a mistake when they build that file path and don't sanitize that parameter, they might be vulnerable to directory traversal. But that's something that happens later in. I mean, that happens at runtime, right? And so hopefully they wouldn't be using the same library wrapper that lets them read encrypted secrets, right? I mean, they might, but it's kind of it seems less likely, and it gives you, at least as a developer, it gives you kind of and also as a code reviewer, it gives you a clean way to separate these two functions into separate APIs, right? So you can have a read highly valuable secret from disk library that then uses the XADDR or the TPM, whatever mechanisms underneath, and then you would be fairly sure that that path doesn't get invoked based on, or you could be fairly sure that that path doesn't get invoked based on external input later in the serving stages of the application. So that might be kind of a reasonable way of doing this.
I think my questions around that, I think an XADDR would be tremendously easier to digest from the application. I guess I have questions around what we would do for Windows and sandbox containers. I don't have any knowledge of equivalence in Windows, and I'm not very familiar with how volumes work for sandbox containers.
I mean, another way of doing it, I mean, they're all kind of, things that won't reliably prevent exploitation or prevent mistakes, but they sort of go a reasonable way towards that, right? I mean, one other way that might work is that you have a mechanism where the secrets files are read once or something, or they can only be read until the application signals that it's ready or something like that, because typically these need to be read at startup.
Mm-hmm.
Or you could have like a read once file that contains the key that then allows you to decrypt everything else, right? So you might have a thing that you might have one particular file name that the application has to basically read first thing and can be read only once, and then that contains the key that encrypts everything else. That might work as well, right? And might be more portable. I don't know. I mean, I'm not, I'm probably not the right person to suggest implementations because I don't really know the underlying machinery very well. But although these things seem kind of roughly equivalent, right, in the sense that the main goal is to make it so that a normal file read that might be subject to directory traversal can't access those files, and you have to do something special to get the secrets out.
Yeah, to be fair, a lot of the motivation behind this method of providing secret data to applications this way is because a lot of them aren't easily adapted to using something custom, like some custom code or something. So there's a pretty large category of applications for which improvements here, like read an XAT or call with an extra library, wouldn't actually be usable.
Yeah, and that's fair, right? I mean, I think this is not really making a current situation worse, right? Because it's a somewhat common pattern to have secrets in configuration files, right? Like for web servers, it's common to put database passwords in there, or like the XSRF encryption key or a signing key and stuff like that. But at least providing like a better way of doing this going forward is probably still useful, right? Even if a lot of applications might not actually use it without some refactoring.
And I think if we, one way that this comes up in our applications a lot, like you said about applications that aren't ready to consume this stuff, right now you can only do the get environment variables out of config maps and secrets. You can't get environment variables plucked out of, say, arbitrary volumes mounted. But if you could, it would allow us to do more things like fetch that data in memory and hand it back to the kubelet, let's say, in memory, rather than having to write it to disk as an interchange medium between the two.
Oh man, there's a really old issue that is really long about supporting downwards API for secrets in environment variables. And it has been a source of a few CVEs because those get leaked into logs all the time. I think they were leaked into, I think Calico was doing this, and they had a CV about it, and it's getting published into kubelet logs. And those are available to anybody with read of the proc file system.
Okay.
And yeah, that exists because a lot of applications are built to assume that that's where they're going to get their configuration data.
Yeah. Right. So yeah, in that way, and you can also then, if you get in the environment, you can jam it into the command line flags. So in other words, applications can be written saying, I don't know where this data comes from, but I think what I hear you're arguing for is they really should be written in a way that says, hand me a config file and I'll read it.
Yes, that way you can use standard file permissions to lock it down. We don't even do a good job with file permissions for these things. It's not a great situation currently.
So I'm trying to understand what we can do here, right? Because like the whole like reading environment variables or reading files off the disk, as Jordan said, basically exists to meet applications where they exist today. If you're willing to change your application, right? Like you could just, I don't know, use Vault or whatever and make an API call, get your secret, right? Like, I know, is it some, I think it's somewhere in the agenda for the whole CSI driver stuff.
Yeah,
Like,
next. Yeah.
right, like if you had a flow where you can use your, you know, like your token request bound service account token to sort of bootstrap your identity and then have some external system authorize you, right? Like you have a pretty good flow, but I don't,
What about core Kubernetes components?
in which sense?
Like the
Like rely,
API server.
they can't use Vault. They can't rely on a non-built-in mechanism.
Right. I mean, but we can change them to do whatever we want.
Yeah. So I don't think we can change defaults. I agree with you. And I don't think we can remove any of the less than ideal ways of plumbing secrets. However, I think there are ways that we could improve secrets that would benefit core Kubernetes components, and then I guess, and then they would go on to benefit people running on Kubernetes who had the flexibility to update code and modify code to consume secrets from with a different mechanism.
Yeah. So the things Mike was mentioning and like thoughts I had are like simple or relatively straightforward options that people could opt into to improve security posture. Things like requiring access to a file and, you know, data used to decrypt what's in the file. So whether it's from an extended attribute or from a separate source, an environment variable or something, or even time-based things like saying, I need this secret information to start my server, but once it's started, I don't actually need it anymore. You could clear this out. So
Yeah.
like before I start serving user requests and exposing myself and getting put into the rotation to get the internet routed to my server pod, please go ahead and delete all of these secret things. I don't need my key on disk. I've already read it into memory. Stuff like that.
I mean, that sounds reasonable, right? Because we're saying that we're going to harden components that we have the capability to harden. And if some external party can also do that, then here's some options for you.
And it becomes simple best practices, like consume this at startup and remove it from disk, or consume it and decrypt it using this method. And it's just putting one more barrier in the way. So you have like this defense in depth. So that someone, you know, trivially gets the ability to make the server scrape a file URL and return it to them, that's not sufficient to just read an arbitrary secret.
One other question that sort of relates to that is to what extent there are mechanisms that allow like a security reviewer or auditor or, you know, a security organization to ensure that these best practices are actually followed, right? So is there a way to say, I mean, it would be kind of nice to have a way to say at a cluster level or some kind of top level that, you know, this best practice, say, all the secret mounts disappear after the application signals it's ready, is actually implemented, and you don't have to go and chase through every configuration over time that people are following these practices in your org. I don't know if there's such a mechanism or
if it was API driven, we would probably recommend an admission admission control plugin,
Okay,
admission control plugin. Gatekeeper would be probably the recommendation.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, as long as it's API driven, Gatekeeper can probably handle it. Jordan, any final comments on what you think the API would look like?
I mean, attributes on secret volume, probably.
And projected.
Yeah, I mean, all the various ways we get to inject secrets. So
yeah.
I think if we wanted to make progress on this, we'd need to make a compelling case that the risk is real and that these enhancements would significantly mitigate that risk, and that they are actually feasible for a good number of applications to pick up and make use of.
Well, we have this beautiful security audit finding that we can point to. We have
Is that what this is? This was different.
It's a directory traversal in the API server. I think it fits. And then there's also, if we ever figure it out, there's the transition to the new service account tokens, which is a secret behavior change that we could make even harder by saying now you have to do something else for default Kubernetes secrets, or the default service account secrets.
I'm not sure about that last bit. But.
So we have a difficult change to make.
You're saying we could make it difficult, even harder for ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, but it's like, how much harder is that? Is it like 10% harder on something that's already like really, really hard, or do we have to redo it?
Given how broad consumption of the Kubernetes service account credentials are, that seems really, really hard.
Yeah.
That seems way more than 10% harder.
Although I think a lot of that consumption is automatic, in the sense that if somebody's using a library that has the in-cluster config mode, it knows where to look.
Automatic, yes, but not by a narrow set of libraries that we control, by like hundreds of different quote-unquote libraries and scripts and mechanisms.
Yeah.
I think you're probably right about that. Awesome. Well, probably the follow-up here is to at least create a feature request.
Maybe start enumerating some of the potential concrete changes and start thinking about like pros, cons, measuring it against like how consumable would this be, how big a change would it be to support, things like that.
Support migration. Cool. Awesome. Thanks for the discussion topic, Christoph.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Following the discussion on Slack, how can we get CSI drivers service account tokens?
Yeah. So I've spent time over the last couple of days implementing the groveling around here that's mentioned, where I've got a CSI driver that has host path mounts, and when it gets a volume publish request, a node publish request for a pod, it goes out and does one of two things. If you pass it a context value where you give it a mount name, you tell it use this projected service account token mount, it goes and it tries to read a token out of the mount path that it concocts. Otherwise, if you don't give it that hint, it tries to figure out if you've got the default token auto-mounted, goes and reads the pod and reads the service account to figure out what the secret name is and finds the mount. And it goes through all these machinations to go find this file on disk and read it, and then also tries to figure out, okay, and how often should I reread it if it's a projected token, it's going to expire. So this is all really hard. I'm not sure if this is the right way to be going about this. Where the idea is, what's the motivation, that this CSI driver is trying to get a service account token to go authenticate with Vault on behalf of the pod and go read go operate on Vault, whether to read secrets or acquire TLS assets from Vault.
Yeah, that sounds terrifying.
I think it works, but it's like, I don't know, 100 something lines so far of, picking around in details that probably aren't supposed to be the business of a CSI plugin.
Yeah, I mean, just as a goal, obtaining a token meant to be sent to the API server to use it to communicate with anything other than the API server is not something we want to encourage or enable.
Got it. Yeah, it's a lot of people have not even tried using the projected tokens, but that's something we'll certainly push for because we can set an audience value on them and configure Vault to only accept tokens with that audience. But as a way of accepting people where they are today, we have a lot of people just using normal service account tokens.
Yeah, but this issue and pull request was wanting to make that sort of handoff of an API credential part of an API or part of something that the Kubernetes components of the CSI sidecar explicitly did for you. And so that seems a step beyond. Like we gave you an API token, and if you want to send it to Vault, like that's not a great idea, but you can. That's different than we will give you an API field that will let you do the same thing.
Well, I'm sorry. Are you talking about the projected tokens as well? Are you also?
No, specifically the legacy service account tokens.
The idea that the token that's the API server token that's mounted at the path that pull request is looking for.
Oh yeah, sorry. I wasn't here to endorse this.
Okay. Yeah, I think using the projected tokens to get audience-specific credentials, a potentially reasonable thing to do. There's a little bit of a question about whether the pod author would expect the CSI plugin to be able to obtain credentials on behalf of the pod. That would surprise me if I were writing a pod. So I'm not sure how we make sure that pod authors aren't surprised or opt in, or like how that.
I would expect that it would be some sort of flag, like one of those volume context flags, because the pod author, I'm talking about for ephemeral CSI volumes here. So the pod author mounts the CSI volume, nominates the driver, and can also pass flags through a map of string to string. So if there was some sort of flag like, publish token to driver or whatever, and he would nominate one of the mounted tokens.
So similar to when you like when you SSH is something, you configure it to say like forward credentials. Like as long as it's visible in the pod that a token for the service account is going to that driver, and maybe what the audience is, then that seems like it could be reasonable.
Well, it's not always this.
I guess the way that the code I was describing today, if you omitted the part that I said about where I go looking around for the default token in the absence of a flag telling me which one to use, if you cut that out, it's what would be helpful for something else besides my driver to do, to be able to hand that to my driver to say, the pod author offered to you this token, and then I would be able to just get the token bytes rather than needing to go read those files off of disk, kind of snooping around the back of where volumes are mounted on the file system.
Aside from the fact that it would break node isolation, why not just ask the API server for the token directly?
Sorry, can you repeat that? What was the last part of that, Tim?
Yeah, couldn't the CSI driver just ask the API server for the token directly?
Like,
Say,
if the cluster admin has decided that this CSI driver should be able to get tokens for all service accounts,
just give a token request, say, give me a token with this audience, with an audience of Vault for this pod. It would completely go around the node authorizer, so we'd probably want some way of limiting that access.
Oh, you mean because you could request for a pod on any node, not just on the node where the CSI driver happens to be running?
Yeah, there wouldn't, with the current mechanisms, there's not a way to say like that this drive, you would have to grant access to the driver to get any service account token, essentially. So you'd want some sort of proxy in there that says, you know, you can only get tokens for pods on the same node that are actually using this volume.
Yeah, because you're saying that, yeah, in the sense that the cluster administrator won't trust the CSI driver to do the right thing, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think when Mike had originally mentioned like driving it in the same way that we drive the projected volumes, was that you inherently get all the protections of the node authorizer because it's the kubelet actually doing the request and then hands it off, right? And I think that's the primary use case, right? You have one path, so as long as that path is protected, you don't have to build a separate path that then has to go and, right? Like I could imagine another admission plugin that says, oh, this is a CSI driver using a token request, so let me make sure that it's allowed to do this particular instance of token request.
I can't tell if you guys can hear me now.
We can.
Awesome. All right. Sorry about the background noise. I switched mics. What do you think about specifying this at the driver level? I think there's a global driver object. Say the Vault driver needs tokens for Vault. That's configured when the driver is installed in the cluster, and the CSI volume specs remain basically the same.
Yeah, I think the only negative of that is, it's not even a negative, it might be weird for a person making a pod that then uses that CSI volume to like give a token to that CSI driver. I mean, maybe it's okay. Like if it's audience scoped and maybe there's controls on the actual audience. So instead of requesting a particular audience, you're requesting like a postfix, and like the API server will always, or sorry, the kubelet will always put like a prefix that sort of guarantees that you can't pick an audience that's good.
Yeah. So in some cases, we'll want the audience to be the API. For example, the JetStack cert CSI driver. Isn't that global object basically global, and you need cluster admin to configure it? Is it sufficient that it's hard to install CSI drivers on random clusters?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the cluster admin could do, sorry, I was going to say the cluster admin could add any kind of like admission webhook to mutate your pod to do something else that you didn't expect. So I don't necessarily think you're breaking a contract.
You should check with SIG storage if that is considered a high privilege object. Today, I don't know what behavior it drives. I think it's more informational. So like the scheduler can see like if a pod asked for this, or if there's a volume for this CSI driver, like what's the topology labels associated with it, like for scheduling. This would certainly seem like a pretty big addition to it in terms of like privilege, like what you could do or mess up for access if you got access to that API.
Only for users of that driver.
That's true. Yeah, so it's worth asking SIG storage, like if that would make sense.
Sorry, I wasn't taking notes. Tim said CSI driver asks, creates token requests directly, and then the current state of the art is look around the file system.
Yeah, yeah. We compute the paths, but it's insider knowledge. Yeah.
And then kubelet. What's the path forward for this? Because I know you're looking at it. I know K Fox is looking at it. And I know that the cert manager people are also interested in it. So it seems like we should do something about this or risk people going with option one because it's the only option.
Yeah, I mean, I had not, Tim's idea is good. I had not thought of it, but I understand there's a security gap there, but maybe like you said, somebody said about an admission plugin could kind of do what the node authorizer is doing there.
Yeah, the other option, which we've gone with a few times, is to just mount the kubelets credentials into the CSI driver. It's not great. We're probably going to break someone at some point when we scope down kubelet permissions, but yeah, we had a proposal earlier in the year for we called it node scope daemon sets, and where that left off was just kind of use the kubelet credentials.
So are you saying in this case, my CSI driver would take the kubelet service account and use that to make the token request calls?
The kubelet should have a client cert, right?
Oh, okay.
Right. So the kubelet is authorized to make token requests for all service accounts that are currently scheduled on it based on pods that are scheduled. So
okay.
You can make a token request for the actual service account. I don't know if you know that, but let's pretend that you do. If you know the service account, then you'll be able to go ahead and make a token request with a specific audience and use that directly.
I think so.
Using the kubelet credentials.
I think service account is passed down. It was passed down for flex volumes, and I think it is still passed down.
CSI drivers do receive it in the publish request.
Yeah, they can request to get pod info, which includes that.
Yeah. Okay.
I would rather have a more scoped down admission webhook, but
why?
It's password.
Why?
It's more least privileged, less privileged, I guess, for the CSI driver. Also, I think that if this becomes a common pattern of just reusing the kubelet credentials, then we're going to start breaking people as we change the kubelet credentials.
Okay, so I thought you were comparing it to just having the kubelet handed down, but you are comparing it to mounting the kubelet credential.
Yeah, sorry.
In that case, I agree with you.
So let me just try to state that again. What, Tim, you're arguing for again is CSI driver does the token request, but there's an admission webhook in place that validates that the pod is running on that node.
And mounting that volume.
Yes. Okay. Yes.
You would have to query the node authorizer and then apply extra validation.
Oh, because you're saying, okay, I thought you were suggesting maybe you'd have a watch on nodes and you get the pod information. No, you'd have to look up the pod.
You have to know the pod. Yeah.
Are we essentially asking people to implement node scope daemon sets externally now?
Yep.
Is that what
Yeah. It's not a realistic ask.
that's what I was, yeah.
I think we should go with making this a CSI driver feature.
So I was going to ask, would it be the end of the world if there was a KEP that we basically ping the storage people on saying, would you be okay with this field right here in an API that you own?
Yeah.
Projected service account token volumes was a SIG storage cap.
Yeah, I would actually ask SIG storage to write that. Like this is proposing a thing for CSI drivers. Like I think it's a SIG storage driven feature that we can give input on, but
I think, do we have an issue for this or is it just a PR?
just a PR, at least when I looked at it.
Is this should we have an AI for a feature request and have dump some state into it and then have some kind soul volunteer to write a SIG storage cap?
I think that is the action item. It seems like a SIG storage thing, maybe. I would definitely take it to the CSI folks and say, does this make sense? Big picture for CSI. If so, like we have some thoughts on how this could work. And it seems like there could be a path forward for it. So
awesome. Well, thanks everyone for the discussion. Sorry, Mo. Sorry, Nick. We'll see you in the new year to discuss AES, CVC, and GCM, and SIG Cloud, Docker external credential providers.
And I think we skipped over the whole go over KubeCon. We can do that next year.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'll hoist those all up to the January 8th meeting. Oh, sorry, Tim. I totally skipped over you. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I will see you all in a month.
Thank you. It's good
Next
discussion.
meeting's canceled.
Happy holidays, guys.
Bye.